Welcome everyone. Good morning in Europe and good afternoon in Australia. My name is Budiman Minasni. I'm your moderator and host for today's webinar. So this webinar is part of the 4x1000 Scientific and Technical Committee scientific webinar. So in case you haven't heard about it, what is 4x1000 or cut per mil? So 4x1000 is not just a title of a paper that I authored, but it's an international initiative that aims to demonstrate that agriculture, and in particular agricultural soils, can play a role in food security and climate change. The 4x1000 initiative was launched on the 1st December of 2015 during the COP21, and it has members now worldwide, including voluntary public and private stakeholders, national governments, local and regional governments and authorities, companies and professional organizations, NGOs, and research institutions all over the world. So 4x1000 initiative encouraged the stakeholder to engage in a transition towards highly resilient agriculture based on appropriate land and soil management through increasing soil carbon. So when we mostly talk about soil carbon, we talk about soil organic carbon, increasing the amount of carbon in the soil through agriculture. Usually we infer, but it's about soil organic carbon, carbon from the plants. But there is another part of the soil carbon, that is soil inorganic carbon, which is, we well known about it, but it's which we rarely talk about it. So how does this soil inorganic carbon, which is a principle, is a very important component of the terrestrial carbon stocks, how does it contribute to our environment? So how does it affect agriculture? How does it affect the soil carbon sequestration? We're going to deal with this topic today with two speakers and one of our two highly esteemed speakers and one panelist. So the first speaker is Dr. Kazem Zamanian, and the second speaker is Dr. Iñigo Virto, and our panel and our discussant is Dr. Rosa Poch. So let's begin. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Kazem Zamanian. So Kazem is a soil scientist at the Institute of Soil Science at Leibniz University of Hanover in Germany. He has a PhD from University of Göttingen, and he has academic experience worldwide, including in Iran, Germany, China, and the USA. And his research interest is in soil or inorganic carbon dynamics and carbon and nitrogen interactions, pathogenic carbonate formation, and linking global warming to soil. As an educator and collaborator, he has guided many postgraduate students and presented many of his works on international forums. But you probably know more about him from his series of papers highlighting the importance of soil organic carbon, the often unaccounted and irrecoverable carbon source. So without further waiting, so I'll hand over to Dr. Kazem Zamanian. Over to you, Kazem.
Yeah, thank you very much, Budiman. First of all, thank you very much, Budiman, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here, and I hope we can have a nice discussion about soil inorganic carbon. I would like also first to thank many of my colleagues. I just wrote the names here that we have already lots of discussions about this topic. And yeah, my topic would be now mostly about the stocks and functions and the consequences of land use for soil inorganic carbon. Yeah, as you know, there are, as Budiman said, there are two types of carbon in soils, organic carbon and inorganic carbon. To say what I mean with inorganic carbon, let us assume a soil system containing three phases: solid, liquid, and gas. Soil inorganic carbon can be found in the solid phase of the soil, and generally it contains any type of carbonate containing mineral, mostly in form of calcium carbonate. And we know this solid part of inorganic carbon as SiC, or soil inorganic carbon. SiC can be divided also into 3 groups based on its formation mechanism and also the morphology. It can be geogenic carbonates, which are inherited from parent material like limestone blocks in the soil. It can be biogenic carbonates, which are part of the organism's body or their skeletons, like shells, land snail shells, eggshells, or they can be pedogenic carbonates. Pedogenic carbonates are formed in soil and by soil forming processes, and provide a variety of morphologies and from different sizes, from microscopic sizes to even a soil horizon that can be completely cemented by carbonates. Inorganic carbon can also be found in the liquid phase of the soil, where generally the CO2 in the soil gas will be dissolved in soil water and provides various dissolved CO2 species that we generally know as dissolved inorganic carbon, or DIC. If the solid phase of inorganic carbon is present in the soil, there can be also to some extent dissolution of SiC and its contribution in dissolved inorganic carbon. There is a huge uncertainty about the global distribution and the stocks of inorganic carbon, but it can be estimated that at least something about half of the global land surface area are calcareous soils, or the soils that have calcium carbonate in the first meter. Such soils store something about 1,000 petagram down to 1 meter, and something up to 2,300 petagram carbon down to 2 meters. So it's already a huge amount of carbon. And if we consider also another 1,400 petagram as dissolved inorganic carbon, the stocks of inorganic carbon will be even much larger. We can compare that with the stocks of organic carbon. Generally, whenever we have the highest stocks or the highest amount of inorganic carbon, there are the smallest or the smaller stocks of organic carbon. But when we compare the stocks at the global scales, especially when the deeper depths are considered, the stocks of organic carbon and inorganic carbon are comparable. So inorganic carbon is also a huge carbon pool. And as any other large carbon pool, any changes in this carbon pool also should have considerable effects for the global carbon cycles in general, and also global effects for the atmospheric CO2 and the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. However, when we look at the research that we have done so far, for example, only for the last year in 2022, there were something about 2,500 articles published about soil organic carbon, nearly half of that in relation to climate change. But at the same time, only something barely about 100 articles were published regarding inorganic carbon and its contribution in atmospheric CO2. So I would like to say that inorganic carbon is totally overlooked carbon pool so far. And that's mostly because of this general belief that inorganic carbon does not respond to management. And this also comes from this fact that, inorganic carbon is not involved in biotic cycles, not as much as soil organic carbon. Anyhow, in my opinion, to understand the dynamic of inorganic carbon, we should differentiate between its dynamic in natural ecosystems and anthropogenic ecosystems, like, for example, agroecosystems. In natural ecosystems, the dynamic of inorganic carbon is generally controlled by soil respiration, or better to say, by atmospheric CO2. There would be dissolution of CO2 in the soil water, production of carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid can dissolve calcium carbonate. As you see here, actually, this reaction is kind of carbon sequestration, as long as these bicarbonate ions remain in solution. But as soon as the bicarbonate ions or the groundwater reaches the surface, there would be degassing of CO2 and reprecipitation of calcium carbonate. So I would say potentially the natural dissolution of inorganic carbon is neither a sink nor a source of CO2. But in agroecosystems, we add fertilizers, especially nitrogen fertilizers. And addition of such fertilizers and the nitrification process will provide a strong source of acidity to the soils. And we know that calcium carbonate or carbonates in general are the main or the most important buffering substance of the soils. I mean, as long as we have calcium carbonate in the soil, the other buffering substances like exchangeable cations or weathering of silicates would be of minor importance. So all this, when carbonates are available, this acidity will be neutralized by carbonates, and this will provide a net source of CO2 out of SiC. So there would be a net source of CO2 also out of calcium carbonate. And you should have in mind that in contrast to the natural ecosystems, this reaction is irreversible. I mean, we have here nitrate in solution, and as long as nitrate is in the solution, there would be no reprecipitation of calcium carbonate. So we should consider this as a unidirectional, as one-way reaction, which leads to, in one hand, emission of CO2, and on the other hand, losses of calcium carbonate. And our estimation showed that it can be potentially a significant source of CO2, something like comparing to about 3% of the CO2 emission from combustion. However, to be able to have a correct estimation, and we need to consider many factors. For example, the effects of different types of fertilizer. This is a just recent study that we have done, and we compared different types of fertilizers and the effects of these fertilizers on the acidity production in the soil and the acidity transfer in the soil profile. As you can see, for example, here chicken manure or in organic minerals in general would have not so much, or in comparing to mineral fertilizer, does not acidify soils that much, but mineral fertilizers, especially ammonium-based fertilizers, can strongly acidify the soils. We have also another study on a larger scales, on the European scales, and we found that, for example, in Europe, every year something about, on average, 0.45 kilomole of protons is added to the soil. And such a huge amount of proton which is added to the soil can neutralize carbonates. And there would be something like about 6 million tons of calcium carbonate which will be removed or lost from the soil systems, from the European croplands. Just imagine, imagine how big this loss of calcium carbonate can be. We can just consider the price, the market price right now for carbonates, for lime, and also the what we should pay for compensation of the related CO2, and this can be something about 1.5% of the European budget for 2023. So it's a huge amount of losses which generally does not consider it. And as I said, we should consider these losses irrecoverable. And for example, silicate weathering should be not really significant for restoring of the losses. Because we know that the weathering of silicates is some order of magnitude smaller or slower than dissolution of carbonates. So generally, where calcium carbonate is present, weathering would be not really important. And even if we assume that there is some weathering and release of calcium or other base cations, still we have, for example, nitrate in the solution, and this will not lead to calcium carbonate precipitation. Addition of basic cations by atmospheric deposition might be an option, but it may be important only on hotspot. I mean, where that considerable amount of dust can be deposited on the soil. But generally, in agricultural soils in the Europe, even in the hotspots, the amount of added calcium or other basic cations by atmospheric deposition is still far less than the added protons to the soil. So when calcium carbonate is gone, it's over, and the other processes like silicate weathering or atmospheric deposition cannot restore the losses. Yeah, and we know that when calcium carbonate is gone, all the related ecosystem services will be also gone. I will not go through that, but we know that it's carbonates in general are the main buffering substance of the soil. Yeah, just see here the wide range of acidity that can be neutralized by carbonates, the red symbols. But when carbonates are gone and the buffering substances depend only on exchangeable cations, there would be a very narrow range of neutralization in soil acidity. Carbonates are the main or one of the main soil aggregating agents. It can affect the stability of soil organic matter, can control the organism's activity, and probably it can control the stability of the whole ecosystems. And when carbonates are gone, these ecosystem services also should not be anymore available. But the other topic that I would like to talk is the consequences of climate change for inorganic carbon, which is even much less considered so far. Yeah, we know that when we talk about climate change, there would be changes in precipitation amount, the precipitation frequency, and all of this will affect the amount of soil water, and the water content. And we know that distribution of carbonates in the soil profile is highly dependent on the availability of water. For example, when there is more precipitation, there would be the carbonates will go deeper into the soil profile, and in the other way around. There would be also changes in the vegetation community and the net primary production. Yeah, we will have, and we already have the problem of invasive plants. In contrast to the native plants with a different rooting system and different rooting depths, the invasive plants generally have shallow roots. So by invasive plants, there would be considerable changes in many soil properties, especially soil chemistry, soil chemical properties like soil pH, also in soil physical and hydrological properties like soil water content. And all of these factors will directly or indirectly control the dynamic of inorganic carbon. So not only the agricultural practices, but also climate change can modify the amount of and the stocks of inorganic carbon in soil. So inorganic carbon is an active pool also in response to climate change, and its dynamic may differ between various terrestrial biomes. And once is very well said that substantial stocks of soil carbon is probably cycling unknowingly. To wrap up about what I said that inorganic carbon is dynamic, both in response to land management and also to climate changes. And we should have in mind that the losses are irrecoverable. Yeah, weathering of silicates or dust input will not provide considerable amount of calcium or other basic cations that can lead to precipitation of carbonates again in short term at least. And probably, in my opinion, in future, inorganic carbon can be even more important than calcium, than soil organic carbon, especially that the dynamic and the stability of organic carbon is also controlled by inorganic carbon. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kazem. And for the audience, if you wish to ask questions, there is a Q&A box. If you go down on the bottom of your screen, if you have questions, please type in your questions, and if Kazem, when he's not presenting, he can respond directly, or later we can discuss it in the general discussion. So next, we'll invite our next speaker, So our next speaker is Dr. Iñigo Virto. Iñigo is a soil scientist and also an associate professor at Universidad Pública de Navarra in Spain. So he has a PhD from UPNA, or University of Public de Navarra, and an agricultural engineering degrees. And his career spans over research, teaching, and also outreach. His research is delving into the complex cycle of organic matter in calcareous soils, and he tries to explore the interactions between carbonate-rich matrix in the soils and organic carbon cyclings and storage. So he has led many projects on soil health and reclamation on the contaminated sites, soil organic matter, and soil carbonates. And he has delivered many talks in soil science and fostering the outreach and the industry relationships. So without further ado, I'll invite Iñigo for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Budiman, for this presentation and for inviting me to this webinar, and also to Kazem for this very nice introduction to the topic and the issue of carbonates loss through acidification. My topic here today what is kind of a continuation, let's say, of what Kazem has just presented, and it's about the management of carbonate-rich soils and trade-offs with soil inorganic carbon SIC cycling. I would go in a I organize my talk so that I will remind just some ideas that were already presented by Kazem on the evidence of the interaction between soil organic and inorganic carbon. And then I will go more in details on how this actually can result in changes in SIC cycling in the soil in relation to management, mostly about fertilization, which already Kazem explained, irrigation, which has been the topic of our research for a number of years already, reclamation of calcareous soils, and management of plant and soil biota. And if I had the time, I would like to also put on the table a couple of slides on an issue that I think can be cross-cutting about soil inorganic carbon, and this is the issues related to the determination of its amount and typology in soils. So just to put the situation in a framework, yes, I would like to remind that, as Kazem said, soil carbonates are very abundant in many arid and semi-arid regions. We can see how abundant they are here, for instance, in Mediterranean Europe. And in many cases, these soils are used for agriculture, as we can see in the other picture. So this makes that the question on the interaction between management and inorganic carbon is evident if you work in these environments, as I do. On the other hand, we also know that agriculture can affect soil organic carbon cycling, and the 4per initiative is about this in particular. But we know that it is in the interaction with the mineral fraction that two of the most significant mechanisms of organic matter stabilization take place, such as absorption and aggregation. Carbonates are indeed part of the soil mineral fraction, and as Kazem explained very well, they have a very particular behavior compared to other minerals. And this makes that they can be continuously dissolved and reprecipitated in the soil, because this reaction goes in both directions. So this makes, in relation to organic matter stabilization, this can act at least at two levels. First, by providing calcium, and we know that calcium favors organomineral complexation, but also mineral-mineral unions and even organic unions. And also because in the precipitation and dissolution processes, carbonates can add to cementation processes and therefore to the stability of aggregation and the occlusion of organic matter. All this was very nicely summarized in this picture by Irrecoverable team in Rowley and collaborators, in which we can see that the role of carbonates spans in terms of organic carbon protection from the large scale through occlusion to the very small scale through addition of calcium. But also a second and very relevant interaction happens when we see that pedogenic carbonates can be formed also from respired atmospheric CO2. So in this dissolution and precipitation processes, we can also see how respired or carbon from biological origin can be converted into soil carbonates. And also carbonates precipitation has a consequence in the soil fabric. We can see here some images of an aggregate, a microaggregate carbonate in a carbonate-rich soil and the fabric that it has on the inside. And we can see that these cementation processes are very evident and related to this. So all in all, we can see that there is a close relationship between soil organic carbon cycling and the presence of carbonates in the soil. So the question here is about how agricultural management can interfere with all these processes, and which is the role of SIC in the total carbon cycling of agricultural soils. If we go back to the equation, we can see that the factors that would lead this reaction to move to the right or to the left, to dissolution or precipitation, are those actually playing in the reaction, such as the concentration of reagents, the availability of water, for instance, of course, temperature, pH, etc. And if we think of agriculture, we can realize that many agricultural practices do, in fact, play with these factors, such as liming, fertilization, irrigation and drainage, playing with water, and of course, the management of organic matter that has a role in the amount of CO2 available in the soil and even the own plant metabolism. All this, as Kazem explained already for the case of fertilization, can result in changes in the soil inorganic carbon pool. And these changes can be in amount, as Kazem explained. We can see gains and losses, but they can be also in, for instance, the redistribution of carbonates in the profile. They can be in terms of size distribution of carbonates too, and of course in the typology of carbonates we can see in the soil. And because all these things are related to organic matter protection, they can have consequences also in the organic carbon cycling. Let me show you some examples on this based on some published work and the work we've been conducting in our group in the last years. I won't talk very much about nitrogen fertilization because Kazem just explained very nicely how the addition of protons coming from fertilizers using or containing ammonium either through nitrification or through the exchange of ammonium by protons taking place in plant roots in ambience with less oxygen do add protons to the soil, and how this is naturally compensated with protons. It's naturally buffered by carbonates, which can lead, as we just have seen, to carbonate losses. This is one topic which has been very well developed by Kazem. I will develop a little bit more on irrigation, which is the second management practice that can be very interfering with this. If we consider the equation or the reaction, we can see that irrigation plays a lot because it adds water, and this is important in terms of amount of water. Just to give you an example, this would be the annual water amount that crop that grows in dryland conditions in our region in northern Spain gets, for instance, winter wheat. You can see that we have little precipitation overall and mostly concentrated in spring and very dry summer. When we irrigate a winter crop, such as winter wheat, we double the amount of water in the spring, and we don't irrigate the rest of the year. So this is already a big amount. But when we irrigate a summer crop, such as corn or maize, we can add up to 3 or 4 times the natural amount of water. And this has consequences in the availability of water, of course. But if we also consider the whole water balance, we consider crops evapotranspiration, we can see that for wheat, we have this evapotranspiration, and for corn, we have this. In the case of the summer crop, we change also the soil water regime, which means that we change from a water regime in which percolation is very limited to a water regime in which percolation can happen all year round. And this has consequences also in the movement of inorganic carbon in the soil in the form of dissolved inorganic carbon, as Kazem explained. We need to consider also that irrigation plays in productivity, because we irrigate to increase productivity, and we increase also biological activity, and this plays in the CO2 side. And of course, that irrigation water can contain different ions, such as calcium, for instance, or carbonates, or bicarbonates, And this also plays in the reaction in this sense. So all in all, the net consequences of irrigation on soil inorganic carbon moving or cycling can be diverse depending on the intensity and the type of soils and so on. We have a very nice example of what happens, for instance, in terms of CO2 release from the soil. This is a publication from Hanam and collaborators for 2016, in which which they analyzed the isotopic signature for carbon-13 of the CO2 released from the soil with different conditions of irrigation. Just for those who are not very familiar maybe with this, we assume that because the isotopic signature of carbonates is much higher than that of organic matter, the higher the isotopic signature of CO2, the higher the proportion of carbonates being the source of this CO2. So if we see, for instance, here in any position, we can see that when we irrigate only with water, the closer we are to the dripper, the higher is the proportion of CO2 released from carbonates. But if we irrigate with true irrigation water containing ions in solution, we can see that this increases a lot. So there is a significant proportion of the CO2 release that actually comes from carbonates when we irrigate. Another consequence of irrigation can be, as I said, the change in the distribution of carbonates in the soil profile, or the loss of CO2 of carbonates in the profile. Some years ago, we ran a study in our region in Navarra, in northern Spain, in which we went to 3 irrigation districts. And what we did was check what happened with the amount of carbonates present in the soil after 9 to 10 years of irrigation. And the first thing we saw is that in the 3 districts with different soils and so on, there was a systematical loss of carbonates in the fine size fraction, in the silt and clay fraction. So we tried to create a model to understand if this was because of leaching of carbonates in these soils. And with that, with my colleague Isabel de Soto, we created a model that puts together a water balance, an annual water balance on a monthly basis, and a model for calcite dissolution and precipitation. By combining these 2 models, we could calculate that the amount of carbonate carbon loss through leaching in irrigated systems was up to 30 times greater than that in dryland conditions. And this is already very significant, but still it represents only, it is 1 order of magnitude smaller than the actually observed data. So we have also second consequence of irrigation, loss of carbonates, or at least movement of carbonates in the soil profile. When we then moved to the study of the carbonates that remained in the soil, what happens with carbonates that stay in the soil? How are they? And we analyzed their isotopic signature, again, not of CO2 release, but of carbonates remaining in the soil. And we saw that also systematically, the signature was lower in the irrigated systems, which makes that a higher proportion of these carbonates had been formed from respired CO2, or CO2 coming from organic matter mineralization. And indeed, we did the calculation, and we saw that they accounted for up to 87 to 92% of the total soil carbonates, for 61 to 74% in the dryland system. Okay, another, we have this about irrigation. Another thing I wanted to bring here today is the idea that we can also play with carbonates in soils when we manage them for remediation in the situations where soils are sodic. Saline soils account for more than 1,000 million hectares in the world, half of which can be considered to be sodic. Usually these soils are reclaimed to improve their condition, and this is usually done by supplying high amounts of soluble calcium to replace sodium in the exchange complex. This is a map of the soil, the distribution of these soils. And if we use gypsum in this case, we of course have calcium that is released, but this calcium can replace sodium in the exchange complex. But we can also as we have this source of calcium, we can also get carbonates being formed in the soils. We should not forget that some soils also are naturally rich in gypsum, and this is also a very interesting source of calcium for carbonate formation. Sometimes these soils are amended with sulfur, for instance. This creates acidity, and this dissolves carbonates. In this case, when these soils are rich contain also carbonates, we can also have carbonates movement during this reclamation. So this is another way in which we can interfere with the cycle by managing soils. And finally, I would like to talk about the plant and biota management. There are many ways in which agricultural management can induce changes in the concentration of CO2 in the soil, for instance, but in particular, there is a case that I would like to bring here today, and this is the case of the oxalate carbonate pathway. We can see in this very nice picture published by Syed and collaborators that some plants that we call oxalogenic plants can add calcium oxalate to the soil, either in the form of litter that decomposes, either on the form of root exudates, or because they live in association with oxalogenic fungi. And the point here is that in the soil, trophic bacteria exist that can use oxalate, calcium oxalate as their source of energy and carbon. And in the process of degradation in this pathway, they can produce, or calcium carbonate is produced. There's a number of factors that can affect this process. But again, here we have, from the point of view of agriculture, the fact that some plants, such as nopal, can have some agricultural interest, some of these plants, I mean. Well, we have some other evidences, but I can skip this. And in summary, the consequences of all these changes can be, as I said, direct, in the sense of we can see gains and losses, but we can think also of indirect consequences, such as protection, or the protection of soil organic matter, or greenhouse gases emissions, which can have been presented by Kazem, changes in the soil fabric, changes in riverine alkalinity. In relation to greenhouse gases emissions, I should say that the net effect is not always a source. It can also be a sink. We can see this summarized in this picture by Sanderman. But all in all, we are playing with the system, in the sense that we can actually release CO2 to the atmosphere, as has been explained by Kazem, but we could also sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. All right, and just a couple of slides before I finish. About the issues related to the determination of soil inorganic carbon, because this is a topic that we face when we try to do some research in these topics. I would like to stress especially that in many cases we find problems in determining the amount of soil inorganic carbon because we don't have many direct forms to do so. In most cases, this is done by by elemental analysis, by analyzing the soil sample as a whole, then destroy carbonates and analyze it without carbonates, or destroy organic matter and analyze it without organic matter. What we have seen in some research is that the decarbonation process is in many cases incomplete. And we can see, if we study in detail with thermal analysis here, for instance, that some calcium carbonate can remain in the soil after decarbonation. This opens questions on the reliability of these methods. So we would need new methods, and this is being done. We have been playing with thermal analysis, for instance, as I said. Also, Tiffaine Chevalier and her group in Montpellier have been producing very nice works on the use of infrared spectroscopy, and people are also playing with rockable pyrolysis, which seems to be also very nice in this sense. But I would like to finish with this slide because I think it's a topic that might come out in the discussion, and this is, I can skip this. This is what I had for you today. I thank you very much, and I'm expecting a very interesting discussion now.
Thank you, Kazem and Iñigo. Before we proceed with the discussion with Rosa, maybe I can start with a question. I was intrigued with one of your slides, Kazem. You mentioned about the effect of climate change, right, on the soil inorganic carbon. But in many areas, for example, in Australia, the projection for climate change in Australia, that means there are places that will get drier. So does that mean that we would have more opportunity of increasing soil inorganic carbon?
Yeah, it's difficult to say that, but generally when the climate is drier, there would be more carbonates. But if it goes to carbon sequestration, I cannot say that, because then you need also to have a source of calcium, to have calcium carbonate precipitation or any other kind of basic cations that can lead to precipitation of carbonates at the end. So yeah, you need first to find the source of calcium for that.
Yeah, so it's not straightforward. So, and maybe to Iñigo, so you mentioned about measurement. So nowadays we are doing a lot of for carbon trading in the soil. So carbon in, for example, in Australia, is starting to be carbon trading, and also in Europe, I would believe that you will reach there. So should we account for both organic carbon and inorganic carbon? As you see that if we do management, for example, fertilization and so on, it will boost our crops yield, and it will increase the soil organic carbon on one hand, but in carbonate rich soils, it will also cause a loss in soil inorganic carbon. So what's your thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a very hot question, Budiman. Yes, of course, the point about carbon accounting and paying farmers for farming carbon, which is clearly in the agenda, is focused on this idea. I like very much Kazem's presentation when he started by saying that the reason why carbonates have been systematically overlooked is because they are assumed not to react to management. And we know that this is not true. We have many evidence that carbonates can react to management as fast as organic carbon does. And this opens questions on this. The point here to me is not that much on quantification, which is it's an issue. It's on the fate of inorganic carbon which is lost. Because if we analyze only the tilled layer and we see carbonate losses, for instance, should we assume that everything has been lost to the atmosphere, or can we reasonably think that maybe it has moved down in the profile and has precipitated below, or it is in the groundwater somewhere? So I think we need to account for both, but we also should consider what gaining or losing inorganic carbon means in terms of total carbon budget, if we only account for the tilled layer.
When we do accounting, we should actually do the profile accounting to fully understand what's going on.
Maybe.
Maybe, depending on how much it costs. So maybe at this point, I'll hand over to our discussion panelist, Dr. Rosa Poch. So I'll introduce Rosa first. Rosa is the current chair of the FAO Intergovernmental Technical Panel of Soil. She is also a professor at the University of Leiden, and she's a soil scientist and micromorphologist. And she's interested in the application of soil micromorphology to soil genesis management. And I like that she has a quote that when you try to understand soils, how they behave and how they respond to management or other changes, you see that soils are eventually related to all aspects of our lives. Indeed. So I'll hand over to Rosa.
Thank you very much, Budi, Iñigo, and Kazem. It has been extremely interesting. Well, I have several questions. Some of them go around the previous ones that have been on the floor. I have a couple of questions to Kazem, because the first slide you presented, you said that in natural ecosystems that the soil inorganic carbon balance is neutral. But we have many evidences, as Iñigo said, that, for instance, when you mix with the oxalate carbonate pathway, I mean, there are many organisms that can catch CO2 from the atmosphere. And also, when you have a source of calcium, as you said, other than carbonates, you may have net sequestration in natural ecosystems as well. My question is, should not go to see what are these mechanisms and try to mimic them in managed ecosystems. So to use these pathways as a management strategy in agricultural soils. How do you see this?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, when, for example, I saw a recent article published that they added even oxalotrophic organisms to the soil. Yeah, to even somehow consume the nitrate in the solution, yeah, by these organisms, and also they can also produce oxalates and precipitate calcium carbonate. So of course, we need always to look for a management or any idea that we can get from the nature and transfer it to the agroecosystems, yeah, to we need to increase the carbonates because acidification is a common problem in agricultural systems, not only because of fertilization, but for example, even by harvest, we remove the basic cations from the soil. So any idea that we can somehow increase the alkalinity of the soil by, for example, precipitation of carbonates, yeah, we should do that. We should understand the mechanisms. And as I said, by this number of research about inorganic carbon, I wanted to say that we totally overlooked. We don't know all these mechanisms. We don't know all the factors even that may affect the dynamic of inorganic carbon. So yeah, of course, that would be the best, that first try to understand all these natural mechanisms and then transfer it to the soils. Yeah, so the study of inorganic carbon is far behind the organic carbon. And yeah, when the day comes that we have also 3,000 articles about inorganic carbon, maybe, yeah, we are at that stage. That's,
yeah. So it's an opportunity, yeah, to all the audience. Yeah, please,
sure.
Yeah, you have to attack this issue. Yeah.
Yes.
Another question is that, well, while you were explaining all the side effects of carbonates in soils regarding fostering microbiological activity and aggregation aggregation and all this. I have the impression, because, well, I work with soils with carbonates, that these effects, yeah, are already optimal when you cross a threshold. I mean, when you have, I don't know, 10% of carbonates in soil is the same as you have 10% or 50%. I mean, and even when you have a lot of carbonates, more than, yeah, you have hypercarbonatic soils, then these effects disappear, and then you have other problems. But my question is, in the case of soil organic carbon, it's quite easy to sell this idea. Well, easy not, but it's quite evident that the side effects of soil organic carbon in soils are much more beneficial. I mean, increasing yields and increasing resilience of the soils and storing water and all these things. In the case of soil inorganic carbon, my impression is that the direct effects for the farmer when you manage it and when you increase soil inorganic carbon in the soil, I mean, it's very difficult to sell it to the farmer. Yeah. So I think that these effects on sequestering soil inorganic carbon should be taken into account in this carbon accounting in regional scale, and then rewarded somehow at official levels or at public levels. I mean, as a benefit to the environment, because for the farmer it won't be much beneficial. Yeah. So it's one of the questions, this one. Maybe you can give your opinion on that. Also, Iñigo, I don't know, I think that this is something that should be taken into account when you try to develop policies regarding soil inorganic carbon.
I totally agree that, for example, in a soil with we have soils in arid regions that may have 60%, for example, calcium carbonate, or that all the pores can be filled with carbonates. Yeah, and we have petrocalcic horizons that usually you cannot use it for agricultural practices. I totally agree, but we also know that when the pH goes below and the soil is acidic, we cannot have considerable yield. Yeah, so that's why the farmers add lime to the soil, and lime is also calcium carbonate. So a certain amount of calcium carbonate is necessary. Anyway, if the map that from Europe that Iñigo showed us about the distribution of calcareous soils and the distribution of agricultural soils in Europe, if you see, most of that farmlands are on the calcareous soils, or wherever that there is considerable amount of carbonates. I mean, yeah, probably. The problem is that we don't know these thresholds, up to which amount of calcium carbonate the effect can be positive, and after that, maybe the effect can be insignificant or even negative for the yield. But for sure, we need a defined range of pH for most of the crops. And for that, you need to either carbonates are there, or the farmer will add lime. Yeah. So yeah, that's why I'm saying that what I'm going to say is that carbonates is anyway necessary, and the farmers also know that. Yeah.
If I may add something, there is a point here in relation to what Rosa said about selling soil inorganic carbon storage, that the point of equilibrium seems difficult to find, because we live in an environment, as Kazem said, in Europe, for instance, but even in our region in northern Spain, where farmers in the north add inorganic carbon to their soils with liming, so they can improve the pH. But farmers in the south of the region, where carbonates can account for up to 30–40% of the soil mass, are very worried about carbonates because they interfere also with plant nutrition. And we all know that they can be a problem for growing some tree species, for instance, fruit trees and things like that. So my impression here is that depending on where you are, farmers may see carbonates as a problem or as an asset in their soils. The point here is that we, as Kazem said, we don't know to what extent playing with carbonates, as we are doing with agriculture, has consequences in things that can be evident, such as yield or resilience, water retention capacity, for instance, which is an issue now with the change in precipitation patterns. And I think we just need more research on that, so that we can make an assessment based on thresholds and baselines, and as we do for organic carbon now, for instance.
Maybe we'll take a couple of questions from the audience first, and then we'll come back to Rosa's. So there's one question for Kazem that it says that, do you know how fast the carbonate mineralizations for agricultural soils due to mineral fertilizer application as compared to natural systems? Do natural systems stay stable most of the time?
Yeah, regarding the losses and residence time of inorganic carbon in soils, you mean, probably?
Yeah, probably. I think the difference between agricultural and natural settings.
Yeah, in the natural settings, yeah, the carbonates are there. We know that over thousands of years, these carbonates, because the main acidic agent is carbonic acid, yeah, and it is estimated that something about 10,000, 80,000 years of it may take that carbonate return to the atmosphere, yeah. But in agroecosystems, we are talking about years and decades, yeah. For example, you can see some of the works published by the Chinese groups that they showed large area, I don't know, 7 million years of million hectare of the agricultural soils are already carbonate free or getting carbonate free in the next few decades. So yeah, in natural conditions, we are talking about something like 80,000 years, but in agroecosystems, it's in the range of years to decades, these losses.
And so there's another question from Thea. She said that is it just fertilizer, or how about organic feedstock? Is it going to affect the soil inorganic carbon, the application of organic feedstock?
Yeah, in my opinion, organic fertilizers can also acidify the soils, maybe in a much slower rate, but it highly depends on how much mineralizable nitrogen is in the organic compounds that we added. Yeah, the other problem would be also from where these organic fertilizers come. Yeah, if it's in situ from that farm and we added again the residue to the same field is fine. But if we would like to bring organic fertilizers from another region to the farm that we are interested, we actually acidify another area in favor of increasing the pH in our case. Even, for example, for biochar would be also the same from where this feedstock for biochar production comes. So yeah, organic fertilizer can also acidify the soil. It's also not only fertilizers. We can add acidification can be for many other reasons. For example, even by harvesting, we remove the basic cations from the soil, or by adding leguminous to the soil and production of leguminous, there would be also acidification in the soil without even fertilization.
Yeah, I think a relevant point here is the composition of fertilizers, because not all fertilizers are based on ammonium, and also because you can also add carbonates with fertilizers depending on what you do or how you manage. So the net effect can be not maybe as accurate as if you only add acidifying salts. And this is not a topic of my expertise, but I know this from practice, that depending on the composition of fertilizers can be very different. And my idea is that their consequences in acidification can be also managed by playing with the composition of the fertilizers.
Iñigo, there's a question I think about mineral associated organic carbon. I think you mentioned a bit on the role of carbonate as well in soil inorganic carbon as well in aggregation. So how do you think that the soil inorganic carbon is going to affect the mineral associated organic carbon?
Yeah, well, this is a very pertinent question, because we know that calcium plays a lot in the formation of mineral components, but it is not the only factor. We did years ago a study to understand which was the effect, for instance, of the presence of carbonates in aggregate formation and organic matter stabilization and incorporation, fresh organic matter incorporation into the soil. And we saw that the mere presence of carbonates in a concentration of 10%, for instance, can slow down a lot the incorporation of fresh organic matter into aggregates and organomineral complexes, because it grants stability of aggregates, and this is good for aggregate stability. But this also implies that the turnover of aggregates is slower, and therefore the incorporation of new organic matter into aggregates can be also slowed down when aggregates play an important, or are an important part of the mineral fraction. And the fact is that there is research saying that under the same conditions of climate management and etc., soils that have carbonates can store more organic matter than soils which don't have carbonates in semi-arid land, etc. So there is natural evidence, let's say that way, that carbonates do promote organic carbon stabilization. But the mechanisms are mixed. We can maybe not isolate, I mean, in the field, of course, in the lab, we can isolate whatever, but in the field, we cannot always isolate the effect of calcium from the effect of dissolution and precipitation, and maybe occlusion of organic matter, or limitations for water or oxygen movement in the pores when we have calcite being precipitated everywhere. So I think that I know that research has been done, but maybe we would need more details into the particular processes, because we cannot think of carbonates only as a source of calcium or only as a cementation agent, because they do both.
Okay, Rosa, do you have further questions for discussion?
Yeah, well, questions, I have a lot of questions. But I think that what is evident from this talk is that there are many, many questions that have no answer yet. Yeah, so I would encourage the audience, yeah, to take this research issue and try to answer some questions. I just made a rapid summary of what are the questions I think that need urgent research. The first one would be knowing in depth the different acidification potentials of the different amendments and fertilizers that are in the market. Yeah, I think that this would be very important for any policy that you want to build upon inorganic carbon sequestration. Another one is the issue of monitoring, reporting, verification. I think that is extremely difficult. In organic matter, it's easier because it's just measuring how it increases. But we have seen from the talks of Iñigo and Kazem that sometimes the loss of calcium carbonate is a gain or a loss, or I mean, it can. It's not just looking at the amount of carbonates you have in the soil, because it interacts with irrigation water, with fertilizers, and with organic matter and all this. So how monitoring, reporting, verification mechanism for CO2 coming from inorganic carbon should be built. Another one is another issue that is important to study is the role of or what are the plants that can calcify, so the calcium carbonate building plants, yeah. Also the oxalogenic, oxalotrophic bacteria and biota that can exist in the soil, how they interfere with that. And I think that it's also especially interesting because calcareous soils, as it has been shown here, are mostly in arid areas. So these areas have low potential to sequester organic carbon because of lack of water. So this would be a good opportunity to value the soils and to have these soils playing a role in regulating climate change by agricultural management. And maybe the fourth is to study more in depth what are the other benefits, the ecosystem services that are increased by having inorganic carbon in the soil. Yeah, so I think that it could also give some value, yeah, some additional reasoning to sell this inorganic carbon. Yeah, I don't know if you have any comment on that, or you see any research gaps besides what I have said. But
there is a couple of questions in the chat that I saw that might be related to this. One is from Tiffaine Chevalier, and she asks about if we can consider all the inorganic carbon in the soil having the same role, or if we should maybe be more picky in determining what part of the inorganic carbon pool is important. And of course, there we have the size distribution, which is really important. We know even in regular agricultural assessment, we determine what we call active carbonates, which are those in the clay size fraction, because we know that they are more reactive and more prone to dissolution and interfering with plant nutrition and so on. But in addition to size, we might also consider some other aspects of distribution in terms of depth, for instance, that might be also in the assessment of what is the net consequence of having or gaining or losing these carbonates. This is a point. Another point, there was another question about how to determine the proportion of inorganic, of pathogenic carbonates. This was my last slide that I had to skip because I didn't have the time. We could discuss about this for a long time. Kazem has a very long time experience about this also. And I think it's a topic of discussion. How can we assess the proportion of carbonates in the soil that were actually formed within the soil or came from the original material, especially because we have, let's say, technological issues that we need to resolve, but also because carbonates are continuously in the move. It's not that you have geogenic that become pathogenic and that's it. They can redissolve and reprecipitate all the time. So this is also a point that maybe we should be able to determine with more accuracy if we want to have the whole picture. This is my impression. And in terms of innovative agricultural management, I don't know, there's a lot of talking about regenerative agriculture, for instance, and things like that. Why not including in the strategies this factor, like trying to manage the soil so we can optimize also the inorganic carbon cycling, especially in the lands, as Rosa said, that have this, I wouldn't like to say problem, but they have this characteristic that they contain high amounts of carbonates.
Well, related to that, the last slide that you escaped is on micromorphology. And well, since I am micromorphology, I have to sell this technique because I think that is one of the ways to identify more clearly the pathogenic carbonates. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think we've covered a lot of topics, interesting topics. It's certainly some topics that we know we have a lot of things we have a lot of research going on. So audience, this is the next topic for the next 10 years. So organic carbon has reached its peak. Now 2,000, more than 2,000 papers a year, but we still have not understand. We still have only a scratch in the beginning of a soil inorganic carbon, especially as Rosa said, what's the ecosystem services that it provides so that we can actually sell it or make it, because this is part of the carbon cycles that we cannot ignore. We cannot just focus on organic carbon, but then ignore that inorganic carbon, especially in areas with the dry climate regions. So I would like to thank Kazem and Iñigo and Rosa for this exciting discussion. I'm sure if the audience wants to know more, they can contact you guys. And before we go, I just want to remind you that there is a next webinar, which is next month. And I think Rosa talks about MRV, measuring, reporting, and verifying about soil carbon sequestration. So currently there are two schools. One is about measurement and one is about modeling. Which one should we rely on? I think this will be the topic. We have two eminent speakers. One is Pete Smith from Aberdeen, and the next one is Alex McBratney from Pete Smith is, of course, a proponent of the modeling approach, and Alex McBratney from University of Sydney is a proponent of the measurement approach. Let's hear from both sides of them. And I'm sure that the inorganic carbon will be one of the topic, and you should ask the questions to both of them. What about inorganic carbon? So why current soil organic carbon model, soil carbon models doesn't include soil inorganic carbon? Yes, so please come back next month for this exciting upcoming seminar. And thanks for listening. And I hope you have a good evening or good morning or good day. And we'll see you again next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.